Welcome back, my wandering mystics, my moon-drunk goblins, and the spiritually exhausted witches. Welcome back to Anonymous Crone, the podcast where we spill the tea about the old gods without watering down magic for modern comfort. I am your hostess with the mostest, the Anonymous Crone herself, and tonight we're going to be stepping into torchlight and shadow together. Tonight's episode is dedicated to one of the most beloved, feared, misunderstood, and one of the most powerful deities in the pagan world. We're talking about Mother Hecate. Some say Hecate. That's okay, that's valid. Some pronounce it Hecate, and well, that's also correct. It just depends on your path, your environment, and what feels right to you. I spelled Hecate with a C, but I've also seen it with a K, and that is closer to the Hellenistic origins. Why all the variations of pronunciation and how to spell it? Well, because us humans can't get on the same page, and we have a knack for overcomplicating shit. Before we dive into her history and symbolism, I'm going to go ahead and just throw this out there. Hecate is not some spooky decoration for aesthetic witches on social media. I do see she's really trendy right now. She's all moon memes wrapped in black lace and silver rings. But you know what? Hecate is ancient. She's primal. She is a goddess who survived cultural shifts, empires, religious suppression, and centuries of being feared. Long before modern witchcraft reclaimed her name, Hecate stood at the edge of civilization, holding her torches high, while humanity trembled in the dark beyond the firelight. There's something so comforting about a deity who doesn't ask us to pretend that life is always beautiful all the time. Hecate, she understands grief. She understands endings. She understands fear and rage and transformation. And she also understands those brutal moments when your entire identity cracks open and you realize that the person that you used to be can no longer survive. She lives in those moments. She governs thresholds and transitions, and that makes her one of the most important spiritual figures for us pagans and witches, walking paths of personal transformation. Now, her origins are pretty complicated, and scholars, they still fight amongst themselves today, but some believe she originated in Anatolia, which is now Turkey, and that was before being absorbed into the Greek mythologies. But others connect her to the Thracian traditions or pre-Greek goddess era. But what's fascinating is that, unlike a lot of the other older deities, who were diminished and snuffed out when the Olympians rose to power, Hecate retained her influence and her power. In Hesiod's Theogony, which is one of the oldest surviving Greek mythological texts today, and if you have Audible, it's free on there. If you want to listen to it, it's only like an hour and a half. You gotta really pay attention because it does really go in depth. But in the Theogony, Zeus himself, he honors Hecate, and he grants her dominion over heavens, earth, and sea. And that's pretty cool if you think about it for a moment. Zeus, well, he overthrew the Titans and he reorganized divine power, yet Hecate remained untouched, she remained honored, respected, and feared. She existed beyond ordinary divine hierarchy. And that tells us that ancient people viewed her as somebody so profoundly powerful and deeply necessary that they kept her on record and they revered her as one of the most powerful deities there. So who is Hecate? She rules the spaces that are, in between things. In between life and death. Between the physical and the spiritual worlds. Between safety and danger. She's also there between who you were yesterday and who you are becoming tomorrow. Pagans, we understand this because magic itself often lives in those in-between spaces. And real spiritual growth rarely happens when life is easy. Spiritual growth happens during heartbreak, loss, shadow work, spiritual awakening, and divorce, grief, illness, and rebirth. The in-between is what we call the Crossroads. One of her most recognizable symbols is the torch. She's almost always depicted, always being shown, carrying twin torches, and that illuminates the darkness around her. In mythology, She helps Demeter in the search for Persephone after Persephone is abducted into the underworld by Hades. Hecate hears Persephone crying out in the darkness, and then she becomes a guide during that terrifying journey. And honestly, that detail matters more than people realize. Hecate hears suffering in the dark. She notices the pain that others ignore. She becomes a guide, not a savior, and there is a huge difference between those two things. Hecate doesn't remove hardships. She hands you a torch and she says, walk through it, face it, and survive it. Don't worry, I'm going to walk beside you, but you're going to have to move your own damn feet. And that's real spirituality. It's not bypassing pain. It's not pretending everything happens for a reason. It's not slapping fake positivity over trauma like glitter on a corpse or a spiritual band-aid. She teaches survival through transformation. She teaches endurance. She teaches honesty, and honesty can be very terrifying. Another major symbol connected to Hecate are keys. Keys represent access to hidden knowledge. It also represents initiation, mystery, and spiritual gateways. And witches who work closely with Hecate report of dreaming of keys. They dream of doors, gates, staircases, tunnels. And these symbols appear repeatedly in magical traditions connected to her because Hecate governs thresholds. Spiritually speaking, thresholds are the moment where you get to a certain point and there's no going back. Well, the death of innocence, that's a threshold. Leaving a toxic relationship, that's a threshold. Coming out and finally living life authentically, that is a threshold as well. But so is losing a loved one. So is motherhood. Spiritual awakening, well, that's also a threshold. And so is the moment when you realize that you've spent your entire life abandoning yourself just to keep others comfortable. Well, that's a threshold too. Hecate presides over all those moments, and she doesn't ask us to remain small. She asks us to evolve, and evolution is never gentle. Hecate is also deeply associated with dogs, especially black dogs. In ancient Greece, dogs were linked to spirits and protection, and also the underworld. Hecate's hounds were believed to accompany her during her nighttime wanderings between the worlds. Some folks throughout history, though, believe that dogs barking at Crossroads could signal that her presence is nearby. And even now, modern practitioners report strange experiences involving dogs when they're working with Hecate. Sudden encounters, repeating imagery, dreams, synchronicities. And look, I'm not saying every random chihuahua barking at midnight means Hecate herself is descending through the veil with a ghost army. But witches tend to notice patterns for a reason. Hecate is also associated with snakes, with daggers, ropes, keys, ghosts, graveyards, crossroads, the moon, and herbs like mugwort and yew. Every single one of those symbols connects back to transformation and hidden knowledge, spiritual communication, or just liminal spaces. In ancient Greece, offerings called deipnons were left for Hecate at the crossroads during the dark moon. And I had to look up that pronunciation too, deipnon. But offerings included like eggs and garlic, bread, fish, honey cakes, wine, and incense. And the rituals honored both Hecate and the restless dead believed to be traveling alongside her. So I went ahead and I Googled what some of the offerings meant and, why they offered that. And here's what I found. All right. So they offered garlic. It's highly associated with Hecate for protection and purification. Raw cloves are frequently left at the crossroads. And then there's eggs. Raw, whole eggs are traditionally offered to represent the life, death, and rebirth cycle. People leave fish. Traditionally, it was red mullet, and that was the most sacred in ancient times, although nowadays people leave sardines and salmon. People leave honey cakes or bread, sometimes crescent-shaped to honor the moon, and are traditional sweet offerings for Hecate. And I'm going to throw this out there. It is raining like a son of a bitch. So if you hear little teep, 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 teep in the background, yeah. Again, we're going to call that background music. Anyways, some people also leave onions and leeks. They're often included, they're used for purification and turning away evil. They also leave red wine and milk, which is a weird combination in my opinion, but they leave red wine and milk together, and they mix it with honey. That's I don't know the significance of that. I couldn't find anything on the internet about that, but some people also leave cheese. Goat or sheep cheese is traditional. All right, so let's go ahead and really talk about Crossroads, because this is one of the deepest aspects of Hecate's symbolism. This is what she's known for. Crossroads represent possibility. They represent choices or potential futures. You can go left, you can go right, or you can just turn around completely. Or, if you're like me, you can just sit down in the middle of the road and have a spiritual breakdown while your ancestors collectively sigh in disappointment. I know I'm not the only one, right? But Crossroads remind us that fate and free will do exist together. Hecate teaches personal responsibility in a way that can feel brutally uncomfortable. She will absolutely drag your shadow into the light if you refuse to confront it. And I do understand that that's why a lot of people are intimidated by her. Some people just romanticize deity work as if it's all pretty candles and moon water and altars and soft mystical vibes. But real spiritual work can be very messy. Sometimes working with Hecate means finally confronting trauma that you've buried to survive. Sometimes it means recognizing your own toxic behaviors. Sometimes it means accepting that your old life is ending, whether you're emotional ready or not. Because Hecate changes people. That's part of her power. Unfortunately, she's been very deeply misunderstood over the centuries. Later Christian traditions demonized many of the pagan gods, especially deities associated with death, ghosts, feminine power, sexuality, and witchcraft. Hecate became an easy target for fear-based narratives. Over time, she was framed as sinister, evil, or demonic. Pagans throughout time, we've never seen death as evil. Death's just part of nature. It's part of the cycle. Hecate walks beside spirits because she understands transformation. She understands that better than most deities. She understands that endings are unavoidable. Humans fear endings because, well, endings force change, and it strips away illusion. Hecate absolutely destroys illusion. Humans fear truth more than they fear monsters. Hecate also became deeply tied to witchcraft because witches themselves, we have historically occupied those liminal social positions. We were midwives, herbalists, healers, spiritual workers, and we often existed outside of respectable society. People feared them while secretly depending on them. Let that sink in. Women carrying forbidden knowledge have always frightened the systems built on control, and Hecate became patroness of those outsiders. And that's just one reason why us modern witches, we connect with her so deeply. So many pagans know what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be mocked, to be silenced, to be dismissed, or treated like, oh, you're being too much. Hecate does not ask us to become smaller to earn acceptance. She teaches us to stand in our power unapologetically. One of the most fascinating depictions of Hecate is her triple form, often called Hecate triformis. Ancient statues frequently show her as three women standing back to back, each facing a different direction. Some modern neo-pagan traditions sometimes interpret this through the maiden mother crone's lens, but this is not what this represents. This symbolism represents her dominion over Crossroads in multi-directional sight. She sees all paths simultaneously, past, present, and future, beginning, middle, and end, life, death, and rebirth. There is something so profound about that. Hecate teaches us to embrace complexity. Humans are contradictory creatures. We can be wounded and healing at the same time, loving and also furious at the same time. We can be confident yet terrified. We can be very spiritual and yet deeply flawed. Hecate does not demand false purity. She embraces wholeness And I think that's one reason that her energy feels so intense for many of us witches out here. She asks us to confront every part of ourselves, not just the socially accepted pieces. I'm just going to say this because lately I've noticed that a lot of people online, they've turned deity work into fearfulness lately. They act like if you do one thing wrong, these deities are going to get super pissed off at you and set your tarot decks on fire. You don't have to worry about that. No need to panic about working with Hecate if you approach her respectfully. These gods and deities are ancient intelligences. What matters to them is sincerity, respect, consistency, but most of all, personal accountability. Don't be scared to work with Hecate. A lot of people that do work with her find working with her deeply empowering. They begin setting healthier boundaries, begin trusting their intuitions. They start leaving abusive situations. They start developing spiritual confidence. They've also strengthened their divination practices. They've started exploring shadow work. And most of all, people reclaim their personal sovereignty. And that's what Hecate stands for. Sovereignty, truth, transformation, wisdom earned through survival. And she is especially important among witches practicing spirit work and divination and herbalism and underworld journeying. But even outside us formal witches, Hecate resonates with people that are navigating major life transitions. Grief, recovery, identity shifts, spiritual rebirth, trauma healing. Darkness is not evil. Darkness is sacred incubation. A seed grows underground first. Transformation often begins in the dark where nobody can see it. Honestly, modern society fears Hecate because she represents feminine authority that does not ask permission to exist. She doesn't soften herself to become palatable. She does not apologize for her own power or her knowledge. She stands at the threshold holding fire while others tremble at the unknown. That archetype awakens something ancient inside people, especially survivors, especially women, especially our LGBTQ community, especially anybody who's ever had to rebuild themselves after life has shattered them. Hecate reminds us that there is dignity in survival, there is wisdom in endurance, and there is power in just becoming. I also think us older witchy folk feel a deep connection to her because pagan traditions often honor elder wisdom in ways that modern culture does not. Society worships youth while treating the aging like decline. But paganism, we remember that older women were once very deeply respected, deeply feared because they carried knowledge. Hecate embodies that sacred elder wisdom. She grows more powerful through experience. And honestly, I fucking love that. Now, if someone listening feels drawn toward Hecate, you don't need elaborate rituals to begin. You can just sit quietly, maybe light a candle. Most of all, speak honestly. You're going to need to spend time listening to your intuition, journal your dreams, and notice synchronicities. Most importantly, though, commit to your inner work. Hecate is a catalyst. She illuminates what is hidden, and sometimes what's hidden hurts a hell of a lot. But healing cannot begin while we remain trapped in denial. One of the most beautiful things people often describe when they're working with Hecate is she helps them trust themselves again. Trauma disconnects people from intuition. You stop believing in yourself. You stop believing in your instincts. You second guess everything. You silence your inner wisdom, your inner knowing. Hecate's torch cuts through the fog. It cuts through the bullshit. It reminds us that the body often knows before the mind understands. That strange gut feeling, that dream that you just can't shake, that warning that you ignored, that truth sitting quietly beneath your fear. Witches have survived through intuition long before modern society taught people to distrust themselves. Hecate sharpens listening, and perhaps more importantly, she teaches a healthier relationship with darkness itself. Not edgy, fake darkness, meant for attention whores. I'm talking real darkness. I'm talking grief and anger, fear, desire, loneliness, mortality. Modern spirituality, it often pressures people toward toxic positivity. Everything must be light and love and sparkle farts at all times. No offense to sparkle farts, but you know. Hecate teaches that shadows matter too. You cannot heal emotions you refuse to acknowledge. You can't become whole while amputating half of your humanity. And that's why us devotees are often very incredibly resilient people. We've learned how to walk consistently through difficult transformations. We've learned how to sit with uncomfortable truths. And we've learned that endings are not failures. Sometimes endings are initiations. So why is Hecate so important to us pagans? Well, because she reminds us that magic is transformational, not performative. She reminds us that spirituality should deepen our humanity instead of inflating our ego. She teaches us courage, discernment, boundaries, intuition, self-trust, ancestral reverence, and respect for mystery. She keeps the doors open and us on our toes. And in a world obsessed with certainty and control, mystery itself becomes rebellion. All right, witches, if there's one thing I hope you take away from tonight's episode is this. Hecate is not asking for you to become fearless. She's asking you to carry the torch anyway, to stand at the crossroads of your own becoming, to trust your instincts, to face your shadow honestly, to honor your dead, to reclaim your power, and maybe, just maybe, to realize that darkness is not always where the monsters live. Sometimes darkness is where the truth lives. Thank you for gathering around the fire with me tonight. If you've enjoyed this episode of Anonymous Crone, please share it with your coven, your favorite swamp witch, or your spooky best friend, or that one emotional, exhausted friend who says they're fine while actively unraveling under every full moon. And remember, the crossroads appear for a reason. And now it's time for question and answers. I will answer your questions that you email to me or DM me or send via pigeon. Tonight's question comes from Standing at the Crossroads. It says, "Hi, I met you at Beltane and I'm loving the podcast." Well, thank you. I am very new to all this. I keep feeling drawn to Hecate. I see her name everywhere. I've dreamed about crossroads, dogs, and torches, but I don't know if that means she's actually reaching out or if I'm just noticing these things because, well, I've been reading about her. I've seen so many people online talk about deity work and how there are strict rules and secret signs and ways to offend a goddess if you make a wrong move. What if I'm not experienced enough, or if I do something wrong? What if I'm imagining the connection? What if she doesn't really want me? How do I even begin? Signed, Standing at the Crossroads. Well, thank you for writing in. And let me tell you something that I wish more new practitioners heard before the internet convinced them that spirituality requires passing some sort of cosmic entrance exam. You don't need to be perfect to approach the sacred. So, yes, Hecate is the keeper of the crossroads, the Torchbearer, the one who stands in liminal places, the uncertain spaces, the places between identities, between certainty and fear, between who you were and who you're gonna be. Do you honestly think the goddess of thresholds is scandalized by beginners? Oh, the fear of doing it wrong is usually born from some human anxiety, not divine wrath. Ancient worship was not a single perfect script. Humans have always approached the divine imperfectly. So let's untangle this. First, are the signs real? Well, yeah, sometimes. Sometimes a dream is meaningful. Sometimes a sudden pull toward a deity does matter. Sometimes symbolism starts showing up because your subconscious is paying attention. And sometimes a dog is just a dog. Not every coincidence is a cosmic telegram, and, well, that's all right. You don't need proof of supernatural recruitment to begin building a spiritual relationship. So let me go ahead and say that again. You do not need to be chosen to be sincere. A deity is not a high school clique. If you genuinely feel drawn to learning about Hecate, her history, symbolism, myths, her modern worship, that is enough to begin respectfully. Second, the fear. What if she doesn't want me? Honey, the divine is not sitting there with a clipboard. No one gets a rejection email from the underworld. Spiritual connection is built through intention, consistency, reverence, and personal meaning, not some dramatic audition process. And your fear about offending her? Willful disrespect? Sure, that's one thing. But ignorance while learning? That is entirely different. Intent matters. If you approach with humility rather than entitlement, curiosity rather than ego, sincerity rather than performance, well then you're already on solid ground. And you don't need an expensive altar, you do not need 12 rare herbs, you don't need an aesthetic black candles rearranged by the moon phases, and you just don't need any of that. You just need honesty, that's it. You can begin simply. A candle, a quiet word of intention, a journal entry, an offer of gratitude, a moment in a doorway, a whisper, if this path is right, then I'm listening. 'Cause that counts. And if you are imagining some of this, well, that doesn't automatically make it fake. Human spirituality lives in imagination, intuition, symbolism, stories, memories, longing, and mystery. Not everything meaningful arrives as undeniable thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a gentle pull toward a torch in the dark. And maybe that's enough. So if you're standing at your own crossroads, shaking and uncertain and wondering whether you belong here, well, the answer is yes. Take a step. The path reveals itself after that. And to every new witch, curious pagan, recovering skeptic, or soul standing at the doorway between fear and possibility, you are seen. Keep your torch lit. So thank you so much for sending in your question. I hope you learned something from this episode, and I've addressed your concerns in your email to me. And for all of you out there, if you have questions for me or cool stories, or if you just want to say, hey girl, what's up? Please email me at acronepodcast@gmail.com. And now it's time for our special guest spot. So tonight's special guest spot comes from Anonymous. And yes, you can be anonymous. This one is a very personal story on how this listener works with Hecate, how Hecate has got her through some really rough times in her life. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. Today's special guest spot is Anonymous. Here she is.
The story is deeply personal, but if it helps someone listening who feels lost at their own crossroads, then it's worth sharing. I didn't find Hecate in some dramatic ritual or mystical ceremony. I found her in the middle of absolute heartbreak. I was going through a divorce, and if you've ever been through something like that, you know it doesn't just break your heart. It shakes your entire sense of self. Suddenly, the life you thought you were building is gone, and you're left staring at this terrifying question of, who am I now? For me, grief didn't show up in neat little boxes. It showed up as sadness, anger, and loneliness, and eventually numbness. I started drinking, not to party, not to have fun, but to escape. Just to quiet the noise in my head for a little while. The shame of what ifs, the aches of feeling like I had somehow failed. Every night became about not feeling, and somewhere in that darkness, I came across Hecate. I know very little about her at first, but when I read that she was the goddess of Crossroads, something in me stopped, because that was exactly where I was, standing in the middle of my life, completely lost with no idea which path to take. What drew me to her wasn't softness, it was truth. Hecate for me wasn't this energy that wrapped me in a warm blanket and told me everything would be okay. She was the one holding the lantern saying, look honestly at where you are, and that was hard. Because once I started doing that, I had to face things I've been avoiding. I had to admit that the drinking wasn't helping me heal. It was helping me hide. I began connecting with her in the simplest ways. Lighting a candle, reading about her, sitting in silence and speaking honestly, even when it felt ridiculous doing it. And what came through wasn't some booming divine voice. It was clarity. One night I was sitting there, drink in my hand, numb going through the motions, and I had this overwhelming realization. This isn't saving you. It felt like the lantern light in the dark. That moment changed me. Not overnight. Healing never works like that. But slowly I began choosing differently. Tea instead of wine. Journaling instead of shutting down. Taking walks when my mind felt heavy. Actually sitting with the pain instead of trying to drown it. And through that process, Hecate became something powerful in my life. not as someone rescuing me, but as a guide reminding me that I had choices. That's what crossroads really are, aren't they? Not just places where life forces decisions on us, but moments where we decide whether to keep abandoning ourselves or finally choosing our own healing. Divorce was one of the darkest chapters in my life, but it was also an ignition. I lost a marriage, yes, but I found myself. And if anyone listening is standing in their own darkness right now, heartbroken, grieving, feeling lost, numbing, unsure what comes next, I just want to say this. Crossroads are sacred places. They don't feel sacred in the moment. They feel painful and terrifying and lonely, but they are places of transformation. For me, Hecate was the lantern bearer who helped me see just enough of the path to take the next step. Not the whole road, just the next step. And sometimes that's all we need. So whether you believe in gods as literal beings, archetypes, energies, or symbols, it doesn't matter. What matters is I was lost. And somehow through the darkness, I found my way home to myself.
Thank you so much for sending that in. I know that must have been tough. And that's just a very good example how we can call on Hecate to help us find the way. Again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, cool stories, or if you'd like the guest spot on a later episode of Anonymous Crone, please email me at acronepodcast@gmail.com. Now let us close with tonight's crone blessing. May Hecate's torches light your way through shadowed night and disarray. May keys unlock the truths you seek for clarity and strength when you feel weak. Hail, dark mother of liminal spaces, moon goddess in all your phases. Guide us true in our need of change through shadow work at every stage. Thank you for the light to see, as above, so below, so mote it be. As the torch dims and the crossroads grow quiet, may Hecate's lantern still light the path you cannot yet see. Thank you for gathering with me tonight. Walk boldly, trust your knowing, and honor the magic in between. See you next week here at Anonymous Crone.